It's my great pleasure to welcome you to our conversation today around cultivating good green jobs for young people in Africa. My name's Miles Gilliam. I'm with my colleague Fred and Jehu, and we're interviewing today Qobo Mayisa, who is one of the consultants from Pragmaleaf Consulting, who led the research on green jobs in Africa. So welcome, Qobo. Really good to have you with us.
Thank you. Thank you, Miles. Thank you, Fred.
We are really excited to learn a bit about this research. You're going to be taking us through two of the main areas, but maybe in these sessions to come. But maybe just give us a little bit of the background around the purpose of the research before we get into the details.
Thank you, Miles. So this research sought to find evidence of existing successful green job creation initiatives for young people in Africa, and drawing from initial policy recommendations from an earlier study that we had done. The study looked at green job creation initiatives that are existing, that have emerged from African thinking, communities, and resources. Now, the case studies were done in 4 thematic areas of climate-smart agriculture, sustainable construction, ecotourism, and recycling. The case studies were in a couple of African countries: Rwanda, Zimbabwe, Uganda, Kenya, South Africa, Nigeria, and Zambia. Now, the key research questions that we were asking is, what are the best examples of green jobs that are being created for young people in the African continent? We were looking at what are the components of these success stories that we find on the ground, and what principles can be generalized from these case studies for those implementing similar work in Africa. And we were also looking at the policy frameworks, what policy asks can be generalized from the case studies for those advocating for green jobs. So examples of good policy, examples of enabling policy, as well as examples of policy barriers that are there, and what are the lessons that can be learned from there. We were asking ourselves, how is the African thinking? Because we wanted to see how is the African thinking coming out in terms of culture or theology, philosophies, values, and how do these contribute to the success of the innovations that are these case studies? And finally, what are the questions that come from what we've found on the ground? Do we identify any gaps? Are there any areas for further research? So those were the key research questions that we were asking.
Great, that's very exciting. But now, jobs. I mean, why jobs? I mean, we know Africa is one of the youngest continents in terms of there's an explosion of young people on the continent. Our demographics are changing. The rest of the world is getting a bit older. We're getting younger. But why jobs, and why specifically green jobs?
So the scenario in Africa regarding youth unemployment is quite grim, if I could use that strong term. 70% of the African population are youth below 35, which is really exciting and presents great opportunities for the future. Unfortunately, more than 12.4 million youths across Africa are unemployed. 95% of the youth are in informal employment, which means that 53.5 million or so, which is about 20% of the young people in Africa. And this is a growing figure. It's changing on a daily basis as young people grow and mature. Over 53% of these young people are not in employment, they are not in education, and they are not in training, so they're neat. And the employment rates are quite high, generalized across the different regions. For example, 9% unemployment rate in sub-Saharan Africa, whilst an extremely high 30% unemployment rate in Northern Africa. It all points at a picture of scenario where we have to create jobs for young people. But these have to be green jobs. These have to be, sustainable jobs. And so we then looked at how can we define what is a green job? And the definitions that we derived are, for example, from the United Nations Environmental Program that defined, green jobs as a subset of employment in the environmental sector that meets decent work requirements. Now, that's just, confined just to the environmental sector. It includes perhaps positions in agriculture, manufacturing, research and development, things like administration, service activities aimed at, preserving or restoring the environment quality, and that these jobs help to protect ecosystems and biodiversity. They reduce energy use, the use of non-renewable materials, they reduce water consumption, and improve efficiency. They help with efficiency strategies that help decarbonize the economy and minimize all forms of waste and pollution, which is where what we're discussing about sustainable construction and recycling comes in. Now, what about decent jobs? How would we define that? We define decent jobs as encompassing opportunities for women and men to obtain productive work in conditions of freedom, equality, security, and human dignity, in which women and men have access on equal terms. And that's a definition from the International Labor Organization. So when we're looking at decent work, then, we're looking at these 6 components. Secure employment. Is it sustainable? It's not just one-off. Fair wages. We could say fair incomes. Are the people engaged in these jobs getting good incomes? Are they getting a living wage, or even better, safe working conditions, which is very important because a lot of these people are self-employed. The social protection, what social protections are provided in these jobs or in these occupations? Social dialogues, are there spaces or platforms for that? And finally, looking at labor rights and, labor standards, because they have to apply, in the green job sector as they would apply in all the other sectors. Now, there are certain skills that we're also looking at promoting or looking for regarding green jobs, perhaps also green life skills, because it's the whole green economy movement should be a lifestyle. So we're looking at green life skills, and we're looking at what skills will be required for that transformation to move from from the current unsustainable economies to a low carbon economy. So when we're looking at the skills for the green jobs, when we're looking at the young people and saying, what kind of skills would they need? You're looking at skills, surprisingly, like business skills, entrepreneurial skills. You're looking at embracing technology. You're looking at things like, financial literacy, financial skills, environmental knowledge and awareness. Even, technical skills like project management, because most of these young people will be running projects, and these are some of the key skills. Softer skills like gender empowerment skills. Those are some of the things that you would want young people to have as they move into green jobs. Now,
and this sounds quite exciting, because on one level, we've had a history in Africa of exploitation, and the economy is often an extractive economy, both from people and the environment. So the environment's been destroyed, people have been used. And so what you're talking about here, jobs with dignity and sustainable jobs, seems to be able to kind of deal with those historical issues that we've had. But also looking forward, it looks like the rest of the world is dealing with the climate crisis, biodiversity collapse, but their economies seem to be struggling with the concept of changing to a way that they could actually work. Do you think that Africa actually has the potential to lead in this area? Is this sort of a green economy because of the particular strengths we have of young people and maybe being able to start from a fresh base. Could we actually be the world leaders in what you're talking about, creating jobs with dignity, creating jobs that are sustainable?
This is a huge opportunity for Africa. It's a huge opportunity for Africa to create an African economy which is sustainable. I mean, this is what we were asking when we were looking at these jobs. We were looking at the pillars of sustainability. We were asking the question, do the green jobs create sustainable incomes and contribute to value chains that are sustainable? Socially, we were looking at the social impacts of the projects or the businesses that we looked at. Does the work contribute to well-being, community cohesion? Do they lift people out of poverty? Does this empower young people, youth, and women? Does it build on rather than violate the local culture? And definitely on the environment, we're looking at, how the projects contribute positively to environmental sustainability, climate change mitigation, and climate change adaptation. And these are real issues that Africa faces right now. And so we sit at a position of great potential and opportunity for us to start, creating the economies that are going to sustain Africa well into the future. And, that will balance the economic, the social, and the environmental well-being of our society.
Thank you very much, Joseph, for that elaboration of the purpose of the research. And perhaps based on what you've told us, what constitutes green decent jobs and what you found out in the research, maybe you may want to take us through some of the highlights of the findings and what came out quite strongly from your fieldwork and from visiting different countries, speaking to different people, assessing different industries. So what are some of the things that you would like us to focus on in terms of the findings?
Thank you, Fred. So when we're looking at the recycling industry, obviously, for a lot of people, there will be a lot of questions that they have about recycling, and especially in Africa, where we see a lot of it being done informally, there might be questions and certain attitudes that we wanted to test in doing our research. And the first thing we wanted to find out is, what is the attitude of African youth, to African green jobs? Now, an interesting survey was done by the Africa Youth Survey in 2022, and it showed that the environment is a key area of concern to African youth. 75% of African youth say they are concerned about climate change and are taking it upon themselves to live more sustainably, and they want the same commitment to the environment from their leaders. Now, the African youth expect the impact of climate change to be dire and want to make addressing climate change a priority in their nations. Interestingly, 5 out of every 6 young people think that their government needs to do more to address climate change. I was blown away by the awareness, especially on pollution and the impact it was having on agriculture and biodiversity and natural ecosystems. So in terms of attitude, I guess that was the biggest surprise, that we found the African youth are very much aware of the impact of climate change and the impact of environmental degradation and pollution on their future. And they want more to be done, to safeguard the future of the world by minimizing the impacts of climate change and the causes of climate change. So in looking at recycling specifically, there already has been preliminary research which has been done on waste recycling, and it shows that Africa generates upwards of 250 million tons of municipal solid waste. 250 million. And an estimated 70 to 80% is recyclable, but only 4% is actually being currently recycled. The rest of the waste is being put in landfills, in informal dumps. It's being dumped in agricultural space, in the oceans, in the rivers, and that's not sustainable. That's actually choking the continent. We then looked at the kind of work which is being done in recycling across Africa, and we noticed that most of the recyclers are what you call small, micro, and medium scale enterprises. And it made us realize that in promoting recycling, the SMME sector, the small, micro, and medium enterprise sector, is going to be a key sector. And how do we define these micro, small, and medium enterprises? These are enterprises that have total assets of up to 10,000 and have annual sales of up to 100,000 a year. They employ at the maximum, the small enterprises, they would employ a maximum of 50 people. And the small, rather than the micro, would have turnover of, say, 3 million. So most of the recycling companies that we studied in case studies fell either under the micro or small enterprise. And so that's a very key sector. There's a couple of companies or projects that we looked at in recycling. The company called Recyclers in Nigeria. There's a company called Reswaye in Nigeria as well. EcoBricks in Uganda, which is one I'm going to focus on because we found that they had very well developed systems. So those are some of the recycling case studies that we looked at. So zeroing in on one case study, which was the EcoBricks that's located in Masaka in Uganda. It's a company which was established in 2015 through the founder injecting, $15,000 to start off the project. They do plastic waste recycling, and they process the plastic into products such as jewelry, flower pots, fencing posts, pavers, and other industrial products. They employ 25 factory staff, and 5 of those are highly skilled in engineering and in finance, in those kind of skilled sectors. However, the important figure for us was the employment in the wider value chain. So EcoBricks works with a network of 2,500 waste pickers that they call resource recovery persons, who they provide with workwear such as uniforms, overalls, and other protective equipment. Now they buy the plastic from these waste pickers or resource recovery persons at between 25 cents to 50 US cents per kg, which is very, very generous. It's one of the highest rates we came across in Africa, depending, of course, on the types of plastics, because there are different types of plastics. There are plastic bottles, there are hard plastics, and they attract a different price. The organization works in partnership with a local church. There's a great partnership. The church donated the land on which the operations are based, and the church, promoted the recycling in that community using their platforms within the community. Now, EcoBricks has worked on facilitating the creation of a waste pickers association that represents the interests of the waste pickers. And it's called the Uganda Resource Recovery Association, which currently has about 500 members. And 70% of the people they work with are women. So there's a strong element of women empowerment in the program. The organization works with disabled people as well. And the important thing is they are helping people who would be unemployed, have no source of income, to earn a living wage.
It's interesting because, I mean, in my context, in South Africa, waste picking is often seen as something that's a job without dignity, or a job that's done by people who are homeless. In your research, were you able to find examples of people who were able to, as you were saying earlier, find a job with dignity, a job that is sustainable? What were you able to find in the research? Are there some good examples of that?
Yes. So there's a young man called Araya, 27 years old, that we interviewed. And he spoke about how he's been able to gain key skills, be able to earn a very decent wage, and be able to improve not just his life, but the life of the family, because most of these people come from desperately poor communities where they would otherwise be, earning nothing per day or even per month. And so the young people that are involved in this program identify it as a program that's helped them with skills, with actual technical skills, business skills, but also with the social skills, the soft skills that you need in order to be able to succeed in life. And these are some of the skills that they're earning from participating in this program. And certainly the incomes were making quite a huge difference. Maybe let me just give you an example then of a lady who heads the Uganda Resource Recovery Association, URA, and her name is Josephine, but they've given her a nickname. They call her Nabachupa, which means the plastic woman. And she's earned that nickname because she's a champion in the community of Masaka for recycling. Now, she's got an interesting story. This woman was a teacher in a local school for 7 years, but she had a keen interest in promoting recycling. She was approached by the local priest, who recognized their potential and said, would you be interested in working, with EcoBricks in promoting recycling in Masaka? So she started doing that while she was teaching. But then eventually she moved on from, that teaching role and became the head of the Uganda Recycling Waste, Recovery Association. And that's an unusual thing. You would expect somebody to come from such a job, white collar job, not to be keen to move into waste, dealing with rubbish on a daily basis. But she was able to do that, not just because of the inspiration, because she understood the impact that this would have on the community, and how much it was empowering, especially the urban poor, and how much it was empowering the women in the community. But also, don't forget, they do earn a reasonable income from the recycling. So to me, that was one great big surprise that came from this research, that actually recycling is a decent job.
Yeah, maybe apart from the examples that you've given around how economically empowering, these two industries are, recycling and sustainable construction. Perhaps it might be interesting to hear from you what other key drivers of these jobs were. I've had quite interesting testimonies and stories from your presentation today. What would you consider are the key drivers or other key determinants of these, jobs?
Thank you, Fred. So it emerged that there is a great need for partnerships to be established. So for instance, with the church played a key role in donating land. The church played a key role in, promoting the recycling in the area of Masaka. We recognize as well that the approach that Ecobricks has taken of helping people involved in recycling to get into a union or an association that, promotes their interests, that helps with training, that helps with, helping that industry to be organized and probably in a way formalized. That was one of the key elements of success. Training is something that should never be left out when doing this. The people that have that are working with Ecobricks benefit from training. They benefit from environmental training, from financial skills, and other trainings that are provided to them that really empower the community. So all these things added together create a successful recycling enterprise, that ticks those 6 aspects we were looking at in terms of a decent job, or a green job, and what would be a good job in the recycling sector and in the sustainable construction sector. I shall mention policy as well, because you need to have enabling policies that allow the sector to grow and to flourish. So that's another key element that I'm going to throw in there.
You've spoken a bit about the role of the church, which I think is really exciting, because as an organization who works with churches around the continent, we really see the church as being the kind of the heart of organizing a movement for change. And so it's really exciting to hear you talk about the role of the church. Do you see any ways that the church might be able to grow into this space? You've already mentioned some of the ways that the church is already in this space, but is there a larger role for the church going forward?
The church is probably one of the most influential vehicles for change in Africa. The church has got access to communities, is in a trusted space. And so the church is a great tool for behavioral change through information campaigns, through publicizing these initiatives, through teaching, the local communities, the importance of recycling, the importance of, proper waste management, the importance of preserving the environment from pollution and degradation. Those are things that the church can do very, very effectively. But like we've seen with the Ecobricks in Masaka, the church also has access to certain resources like land. Could the church create recycling stations, for example, where people can bring bottles and put them in those recycling stations? Could the church, promote, with its young people, the youth programs, the Sunday school programs, could it promote this culture and this mentality of recycling and waste management? So these are all opportunities that are, available for the church. Could the church stimulate the creation of social enterprises where young people, group together and set up recycling, businesses in their communities? These are all opportunities that the church could exploit.
Very important, the role of the church in sort of partnering with these industries, but also helping them in different aspects, like growing the culture of recycling, but also offering some incentives like land, which the church holds. That for me is a huge takeaway from this research. But I wanted to get from you what would be other forms of key takeaways that you found from this piece of research.
So we think that there are 3 key takeaways that I could put forward. The first one I've touched on the behavioral change campaign. I think it's important to launch an Africa-wide behavioral change campaign to influence society around recycling. doing things like establishing youth platforms that promote recycling, and recycling schemes, making recycling receptacles available, whether it's bins, it's recycling stations, et cetera, that will, enable communities to recycle. So there has to be a campaign across Africa to promote recycling. And that's going to have a huge element of behavioral change. So people stop dumping waste, stop tipping waste in rivers and chucking it into the ocean, and they start managing waste in a sustainable way, which is through recycling. The second thing we would want to promote or pick up on as a takeaway is utilizing successful pilots like Ecobricks. Is a successful pilot that ticks pretty much all the boxes for decent jobs and sustainability, social, economic, and environmental. How can we take this and create models and modules for replication that will enable youths from across Africa to come and have hands-on learning? Those youths that want to start their own operations are given some kind of like apprenticeship training in these pilot facilities, where they're given the skills, they can have hands-on, training, and where recycling becomes prioritized in the work that we do across Africa and in publicizing work with the young people, especially in Africa. And then the third element is on policy. It's going to be important for us to get the support of African governments to make recycling a priority, and that could include creating budgets, at a local level for recycling initiatives, getting government support for these, publicity and awareness and behavioral change campaigns, and maybe even getting in policies and legislation that promote the recycling. So to me, those would be the three key takeaways from recycling and sustainable construction, because without these elements coming in, just 4%, as we said in the beginning, of the waste is being recycled, when really 80% of the waste, 70 to 80% of the waste in Africa can be recycled in one form or another. So that requires, collaboration at all these levels.
Thank you so much. That's been a really interesting conversation. And for those of you who are listening, we're going to have an opportunity to connect and really engage with this in much more detail as a community. So this was a great opportunity to listen and to learn, but we want to hear your voices as we start to dissect this information, dissect the recommendations that we've heard, and then take it forward into action. There's no point in doing this great research unless we can start to pilot some new projects and ultimately create new jobs for those young people and perhaps for you as we go forward. But because I was trying to ask the question, many people would have been thinking,
yes,
is this really a dignified job? Because I mean, I'm still not fully convinced by that, but I think this research has helped me to move in that direction, that it can be a dignified job.
You see, the key thing is that the current setup of recycling in most African countries doesn't include the organization that we're seeing in Masaka, which is these people are actually part of an association. These people are trained, they're given uniforms, there's overalls, protective wear, and so on, which differentiates it from some poor 13-year-old kid who should be in school but is picking waste from dumps in maybe Nairobi or Bulawayo. So that for me was one of the key differentiators there. And what that association does is that it enables like the vulnerable to be protected. So you can't have school-going kids involved in this waste, picking waste on the streets when they're supposed to be in school. And in fact, in the presentation, it's there in the presentation. These guys actually have a scholarship program for kids where they're paying for paying their school fees and so on in 30 participating schools. So that
are they actually making enough money? I mean, you're talking now about dignity of organizing and all of that, but compared to say they were going to go get a teacher's job or a job in the maybe as a not a diplomat, as in civil service or something, are you able to make money in this waste picking?
Well, 25 cents per kg. Average delivery is 100 kgs a week if you're really lazy. So I'm told that would be of the low grade plastic bottles, right? If you're bringing in hard plastics, 100 kg is $50, right? So $50 in most African economies is a lot of money, per week. Until last year, Zimbabwean teachers were earning $100 a month. Rwandan teachers earn $50 a month. So in terms of incomes, these incomes are real, but this job has been much maligned because of the lack of the organization and the fact that there's a lot of abuse and a lot of mafias, mafia style working in the recycling. So what Uganda has done, what Ecobricks has done in bringing the order there through an organization has eliminated all of that. And now you have a decent recycling job. So that for me, even I would have taken on my overalls and started recycling in Ecobricks. That's what makes it decent. And if we could do that across Africa, that could change the face of recycling and make it more positive than it is right now. Because at the moment there's too much exploitation, child labor, and these mafias don't even pay these people. Some of them bring in their stuff and we've been told that, we're still waiting. We brought our stuff a month ago. We still haven't been paid for our stuff. And so that's what we want to, eliminate by promoting the Ecobricks model. If we had an Ecobricks model in every country, we will change recycling in Africa in the next 10 years. And I didn't want to talk too much about the financial aspects because it is quite lucrative. There were guys that we interviewed who own trucks. They bought trucks from the proceeds of the thing. There's these ladies that we interviewed them at their homes. They've actually built houses from the proceeds of the recycling. But that's in Uganda, where everything has been done properly using, proper Christian values here. No exploitation, a fair wage, you train the people, you pay them on time. Another thing that Andy does at Ecobricks is, the fluctuation in the prices, like the prices fall every December and then recover around April. So they give notification to people at least a month in advance to make them aware that the price. So when you're working out there, the price of the product, that you're going to be bringing in. You won't be surprised when you turn up with your 100 kilos and you're told, oh no, it's only worth 10 cents now. So the fairness aspect, I think, is one of the key things that we picked up from Ecobricks. And if we could replicate all those values, if we could bring them in and set up a couple of pilots, maybe Uganda is in East Africa. Why don't we set up a Southern Africa pilot, a Central Africa, West Africa, and you start influencing the sector that way. a big advantage with Andy's system is that he's then able to bring the product to the market because they export a lot of their product. And so it's a full-blown commercial operation, when it then comes to the marketing of the products and so on. So rather than an individual trying to bring in 100 kgs of his stuff, or 2 ton, or even 30 ton, because that's too little, these guys bring in 100 ton into the market at a time. And that's very important in terms of prices, in terms of ensuring that you're going to get paid, and etc. So those are some of the dimensions that you guys should be aware of in terms of recycling that makes this model. That's why we zeroed in on it. They are not the only recyclers, but they have the best model we've come across in Africa.
And you brought out the interesting thing, the difference between the mafias and this thing, because yes, there's a lot of extractive. So these guys, the mafias, are creating extractive businesses and they're getting very rich, but the pickers are still living in undignified, and that's why most of us, when we look at a picker, we'll say, I wouldn't want my child to be a picker because they're being exploited every day. They're in the mud. Whereas what you're talking about is a trade union. They organize. It's dignified. They're getting enough money that they're actually living a lower middle class lifestyle, as defined in Uganda. I mean, it wouldn't work in South Africa or London, but in Uganda that works.
In Uganda, it would work. Yeah.
Fourth area of research was around sustainable construction, and I'm fascinated by this one because it's not an area that traditionally people think about much. But when you look at Africa by the end of the century is predicted to have the largest cities ever built in human history. And I mean, that's something quite crazy to think about. If you look at the big Chinese cities, you look at the big European cities of the past, we're talking about places like Lagos being 95 million people in a city. That's kind of like some African countries, that's 2 or 3 times the population of a medium-sized African country just in one city. And if you think about it now, where Lagos is largely informal and lots of slums and informal settlements, if you think about that at that sort of scale, it's absolutely frightening. But if we could sit down and say, what would a life-giving African city look like? Those cities could be things of great beauty and cities which really bring innovation and excitement, because most cultures in the past have emerged in urban areas, and new ideas emerge in urban areas as cities grow and people come together and work together. But I think when we look at things like climate, the construction of cities is often one of the places where the most emissions happen. And so we've got to be able to build these cities in a way that's good for people and the environment. So I'm fascinated by this area, and I'd love to hear from you, Qobo. What are the key findings as you looked at sustainable construction? Where could things be going in the future as we start to build these massive and hopefully magnificent cities of the future?
As you've pointed out, we got to recognize that by 2050, more than 70% of the world's population will be concentrated in cities. And as you say, in Africa, we're going to have some of the biggest cities in the world. Now, buildings alone are responsible for between 25 and 40% of global energy use, and 30 to 40% of global greenhouse gases. This is quite significant. This is major. And while the construction sector and related activities are also the main contributors of local and regional air pollutants such as carbon monoxide, lead, sulfur oxides, nitrogen oxide. And so it's very important to pay attention to the greening of the construction sector or the built environment, including, the building of environmentally friendly buildings and the utilization of environmentally friendly material. And in this particular instance, we are zeroing in on the use of recyclables as building material, because sustainable construction is a broad field. So we're just zeroing in on the use of recyclables. And why recyclables? Because as we've pointed out, that 70 to 80% of the waste in Africa is recyclable, and it can be turned into these building materials, such as bricks, tiles, paving materials, fencing poles, even industrial equipment, household items like bathtubs, sinks, tables, chairs can all be made from the recycled material. And so we went out and we looked for organizations, companies that are involved in recycling, and we found quite a range of products were being generated for the sustainable construction industry from recyclables. So, for instance, Ecobricks in Uganda was producing these beautiful, pavers made from, recycled plastics, hard plastics. They were also making fencing poles. Now, fencing poles is an interesting one, because remember that traditionally fencing poles are either made from wood, which involves cutting down trees, or they are made from, metal, which is normally steel, which again involves extraction. So the use of these fencing poles, which we have seen from different entities, there's a group in Mombasa that was making fencing poles from, the recycled plastics, the same as we saw with Ecobricks in Uganda. They were making fencing poles from recycled plastics. So that means that there will be less trees that need to be cut in order to have fencing done around Africa, if we were to use these recycled materials for this construction. It's the same with the bricks and the pavers. They tend to be more durable. They tend to be stronger. They tend to last longer than your traditional cement-based or sand-based products. So there's a huge advantage there that we also saw with the use of recyclables in the sustainable construction sector.
And you mentioned the word beautiful, and that's obviously not something that people often associate with plastic and with recycling. So these are obviously functional, as you've been saying. They're strong, and you can make them in the kind of shapes and sizes. But are they also something that speaks to the higher senses? That it's a product that you'd want to put in your house when your mother-in-law comes to visit, because rather than sort of Italian tiles or something else, which right now we will put a cultural sort of premium on.
So I'm going to give an example of a small operation. It's a company in Zimbabwe called the Noble Savage, and they do tiles. To do these amazing, beautiful tiles that would rival any of the, ceramic tiles or porcelain tiles that you have out there in the industry, and they are oversubscribed. They are struggling to satisfy the market because the market wants those products, not just because of the environmental concerns, but because they're functional, they're beautiful, they're great aesthetics. But the big cherry on the cake is they're environmentally sustainable. So there's a huge demand. That's the same we heard everywhere. In Kenya with the Genja makers who make these bricks, they can't satisfy the demand. That's the same we heard with Ecobricks with their fencing poles in Uganda. They cannot satisfy the demand because these are items that are highly functional, but they are also, they compete with any of the traditional unsustainable products that we've had out there.
So what would the drivers be for this industry to grow and for jobs to be created, a lot more jobs to be created? You obviously we're seeing some small companies emerge, but if we're going to build cities large enough for 95 million people in Lagos or equally in other spots, obviously a lot more jobs need to be created. How can that be driven forward?
It's important to organize the recycling. It goes back to the importance of behavioral change towards waste management in African cities and the promotion of recycling for recycling-based sustainable construction products to become widely and broadly available. There has to be a huge amount of recycling which is done. So instead of burning waste and throwing it in landfills and rivers and so on, the waste in Africa needs to be recycled. That's the starting point. And there has to be a promotion of a sustainable construction industry. That's at a policy level now. Can we create special economic zones for the sustainable construction industry? Can we create business parks with incentives for the sustainable construction industry? One of the things we learned from the companies that are involved in this, because these are mostly young people, by the way, and the surprising thing is we found it was mostly women who are driving the sustainable construction industry. So that was really fascinating. Now, the biggest challenge they are facing is in getting the factory equipment that can produce the quantities to the quality that they need in order to bring a greater quantity of product into the market. And so there is need for industrial parks, science parks that complement this industry in the fabrication, in the production of equipment, in the production of technologies that help the production of sustainable construction products. So business parks, special economic zones, the policy level, that's something that can be promoted. But also the financing. We can never run away from the fact that you do need a fair amount of money to be able to set up a sustainable construction products factory. With the Jenga makers in Nairobi, for example, they had to borrow money from their parents because they're a group of, it's over 20 young people that came together, and they had to borrow money from their parents in order to start this operation. The Noble Savage in Zimbabwe, that is the same thing. They had to start from contributions of $100 each to set up this operation. So some startup funding for the sector is going to be important for this sector to really grow to that level where it has an impact in provisional products.
Thanks a lot, Joseph. And I think you speak strongly on the promotion of the sustainable construction industries. And I've noted very interesting drivers for this particular industry. But in your view, what could be the role of stakeholders such as the church in the promotion of this, sustainable construction?
So the church has a key role as an information dissemination platform. It will help with creation of awareness. We've got this product. We have sustainable bricks, tiles, fencing poles. Does the ordinary man know about it? How can we publicize these things? And the church is a strong platform for publicity of these sustainable products and sustainable industries. But also the church is going to be key in promotion of recycling and in that behavioral change. So people stop, dumping waste. People stop, littering, and they make use of receptacles and recycling stations in order to drive recycling. And the church can set up, recycling points where these companies can come and buy the products, buy the recyclables from these recycling stations. And so you're beginning to promote that culture of recycling, which is required for sustainable construction to be successful in Africa. And the church itself, a lot of churches are building. How great would it be if the church, in terms of their own buildings, start embracing these products? That becomes a very real and tangible demonstration of your, belief in the need for sustainable construction.
It's interesting how you give an example of churches leading by examples, by using recycled materials for the construction, which is quite fascinating. I would like to hear from you. You've talked strongly about policies, about finances, about the role of communities, etc. And Miles gave us quite interesting stats about how the cities are going to grow in the future in the continent of Africa, and that's likely to be a scenario in the next 30, 50, and 100 years. What were your main takeaways from this particular interesting research? What do you take home from this expedition from different countries?
So there are three things that I will mention as key takeaways. The first thing is to these case studies that we looked at should be used as pilots. We should identify pilots that we can use in order to create modules that can be replicated across Africa. So in that way, we are now really promoting large-scale sustainable construction. And we are also creating sustainable jobs for the young people. So we need to create these pilots that help us create modules and models for replication that provide training and operational, training in operations, training in business, and creating of social enterprise models that can be used for replication across Africa. So it's key that we identify from the case studies which sites we would like to use as these pilots. Secondly, creating platforms that promote this. Like I said, most of the entities we looked at are actually youth startups. These are youth companies that have been set up in sustainable construction. How can we create a platform that will help to popularize, to grow, to provide support, peer learning, exchange of ideas among the practitioners in that space, so that it becomes something that we're promoting across Africa, and we're creating these social enterprise vehicles across Africa that promote sustainable construction. And then finally, the issue of policy. How can we lobby the governments of Africa to make available facilities, as we say, special economic zones, industrial parks, finance for sustainable construction startups, and for scaling up, and how can we create policies that are going to promote the growth of this industry? That's going to be a key takeaway in promoting sustainable construction. So those are the three things that I have in mind, which I think in terms of policy, in terms of pilots, and creating platforms for the promotion of sustainable construction across Africa.
Thank you, Joseph. That's really exciting, and I was lucky enough a few years ago to travel through Portugal, and I remember looking at the clay tiles that they put on all of their homes, and there was a certain point of their history where they kind of invented this technology, and it was absolutely, they had to do it. Their city had been destroyed by a flood. They were building, and they had to find a way to build in a quick way, but also in a beautiful way. And several hundred years later, their cities are defined by these beautiful tiles. And it seems like this is maybe a moment where in Africa we're also defining how we're going to build our cities. What are the technologies that we're going to be using? What are the art forms that we're going to be using? And it's going to shape what our cities look like for hundreds of years to come. So it's exciting to kind of see this conversation start, particularly those platforms that you're talking about, where young people can start to say, this is how we want to build, and actually then start those pilots to make it real. Because our grandchildren's grandchildren are going to be living with the decisions we make as we build our cities now, aren't they? Cities last for a very long time. And so this is a very exciting conversation to be had. I hope we make the right decisions in that process. For those who are interested in this conversation, we will be getting together and talking more about it. We want to hear your voices as we engage on these issues and take this research to publication and to practice. And so please join us at our workshop. The details of the workshop will be attached to this video. We would love to see you there and part of this conversation going forward. So thank you, Joseph. Thank you, Fred.